I'm Sarah Kendzior, the author of the best-selling books The View from Flyover Country and Hiding in Plain Sight.
I'm Andrea Chalupa, a journalist and filmmaker, and the writer and producer of the journalistic thriller Mr. Jones about Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine.
And this is Gaslit Nation, a podcast covering corruption in the United States and rising autocracy around the world.
And the opening song you heard is called Take One Away by Marcus Persiani. Marcus Persiani is a New York-based pianist and keyboard player who has played with such luminary musicians as Dizzy Gillespie, Max Roach, Tito Puente, and the Apollo Theater Showtime Band under Ray Chu. His compositions and arrangements are featured on the blazing trilogy of albums recorded by the late Baza's legendary Afro-Cuban Jazz Orchestra, one of which, 944 Columbus, was Grammy-nominated. Born in Aurora, Illinois, Marcus first played with many local musicians and clubs around Chicago, including touring with Curtis Mayfield and the Impressions and Otis Clay before moving to New York. Now he's currently freelancing in New York City and is a member of the Sugar Hill Quartet, which was the featured house band at the famous Lenox Lounge, Smoke Jazz Club Friday night jam sessions, and at the legendary St. Nick's Pub Monday night jam sessions. So if you need an idea of what to do in New York City now that we can go out and about, go back to this bio and check out some of these jazz clubs. I will be doing that. From Marcus, instrumental music creates a space in that somehow the atmosphere changes when music is played, its resonance altering the surroundings. And jazz, not smooth jazz, along with other grassroots music, has, to me, a central philosophical lesson: the ability to recognize and reject society's programming and to come up with a new thing, no matter how much noise is around. You can come from something that's your own. Marcus's recordings, Urban Fictions and Uptown Suite, are available at TRR Records, and his arrangements are available at 3-2 Music Publishing. Take One Away is off the album Urban Fictions, and the personnel on the record is Keon Harold on trumpet, Emmanuel Harold on drums, Rashawn Carter on bass, and Marcus Persiani on piano. And we'll link to his music at the show notes, which are always available for every episode that we publish on Patreon.
All right, thank you. And on with the newscast of the apocalypse. So the big news this week is that Israel may finally have a new prime minister after 12 years. This is obviously exciting in a certain respect because the world may finally be rid of Benjamin Netanyahu, who we have noted many times is a key node in this alliance of transnational organized criminal actors that we've been discussing every week on this show now for 3 years. I just realized it's like 3 years of Gaslit Nation. However, since this is Gaslit Nation, this is not an entirely good phenomenon because Netanyahu's potential replacement, Naftali Bennett, is incredibly dangerous in his own right. And so who is Naftali Bennett? He is a far-right religious ultra-nationalist who strongly opposes Palestinian rights, has represented the violent Jewish settler movement that is currently displacing Palestinians from their homes, and has proposed that Israel unilaterally annex the Palestinian West Bank. Bennett has bragged repeatedly about killing Arabs, and in 2013, he proclaimed, "I will do everything in my power forever to fight against a Palestinian state being founded in the land of Israel." Last week, Bennett criticized Netanyahu for not being violent enough against Gaza, saying, quote, "I do not remember such a period of weakness. The state's deterrence is at the lowest point in its history." Bennett's main political partner is Ayelet Shaked, a fellow extremist who said that Palestinian mothers should be killed before they breed, and I am quoting her here, "more little snakes." So I'm sure we'll be talking about him more in the weeks to come, assuming Netanyahu actually does leave. And since this is Netanyahu, that should never be firmly assumed. But anyway, he's obviously an important player in the current political crisis engulfing Israel. And another matter of concern is that Bennett wants Israeli Jewish control over the Al-Aqsa Mosque in East Jerusalem. As we've mentioned in the last two episodes of Gaslit Nation, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is located on the Temple Mount. It is the third holiest site in Islam, and it is where Israeli troops were gassing and beating Palestinians during Ramadan 3 weeks ago, in one of the main events that set off the current regional conflict. The Temple Mount is also the location of the Western Wall, a holy site for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It has long been the goal of both Jewish extremists and Christian extremists, in particular Christian evangelicals, to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque and build a third temple in its place, thus heralding a messianic era and the end times. It should be noted that in the Christian version of this plan, Jewish people must convert or die before the kingdom of God appears. So, some conflicts of interest there. As we've noted many times, this is a very anti-Semitic goal and or theory. Until recently, the rebuilding of the third temple seemed like the pipe dream of fanatics, but it is increasingly becoming more viable as the leadership of multiple powerful nations, including the United States, embraces fanaticism, and in the case of the Trump administration, structures foreign policy on either the Rapture, as is the case with Mike Pompeo, who I'll get to in a second, or on expanding Israel's territory in the Middle East, as is the case with Jared Kushner, who I will discuss now. And I put them in the present tense for a reason, despite the Trump administration technically no longer being there. Currently, Jordan serves as the custodian of the Temple Mount. It has done so since 1924 in an arrangement that was made before either Israel or Jordan were nation states. But last week, The Guardian revealed that in 2019, Jared Kushner and his murderous millennial BFF, Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, sought to overthrow the government of Jordan in order to, among other things, take away control of the Temple Mount from Jordan and divide it between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And I'm going to read a small excerpt of that Guardian article. It says, when the plan was finally revealed, Jordanian leaders sensed mortal danger in its implicit intention to share control of the Haram al-Sharif compound, that's the same thing as the Temple Mount, in Jerusalem, over which the Hashemite dynasty of the King of Jordan has maintained custodianship since 1924. Beyond that, the plan rejected many starting points of earlier peace talks, annexing 30% of the West Bank and the Jordan Valley, and rejecting the central Palestinian demand of a capital in East Jerusalem. The offering was so untenable to Jordan that the prime minister at the time, Omar Razaz, warned that its peace treaty with Israel was at risk. Sharing the Temple Mount with the Saudis and the Israelis was definitely something that's the Trump administration, considered, said one U.S. official. They were desperate to get this done and made no bones about blackmailing friend and foe. And so there's a lot more where that came from. You should read this Guardian article, which we're going to be linking to, as always, in our show notes. So yeah, this situation is incredibly dangerous. The danger is not over simply because the Trump administration is gone. We've discussed many times how certain foreign powers wanted Trump elected as a way of getting Kushner, a lifelong friend of Netanyahu and of various oligarchs from around the world, into power in order to carry out both private kleptocratic initiatives and to rearrange the power structure of the Middle East. What's critical to understand is that these plans are ongoing, even though Kushner is no longer in the White House. The biggest example of this is what former Trump officials and GOP members are currently doing in Israel. I'll start with Mike Pompeo. In an unprecedented move, Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State and head of the CIA under Trump, flew to Israel last week to meet up with the head of Mossad, Yossi Cohen, who is about to retire. Foreign officials in Israel were alarmed. One told Haaretz, which is an Israeli publication, I have not heard ever of a former CIA chief coming to Israel to take part in a farewell party for his Israeli counterpart. The fact that he's also a former Secretary of State and that he will probably be making a visit when the current Secretary of State is here, that's Anthony Blinken, only adds to the unprecedented character of the visit. Guess what else is unprecedented? The same former head of Mossad immediately starting an investment fund with Steve Mnuchin, the oligarch-aiding former treasurer of the Trump administration and a central figure of Trump's crime cult. This fund is intended to work with Gulf states and seemingly put the classified intelligence that Cohen and Mnuchin both gained in their positions to use for profit and potentially for political realignment. This arrangement is against both Israeli and U.S. protocol. Cohen and Mnuchin are joined in their operation by David Friedman, who is Trump's personal bankruptcy lawyer before Trump made him ambassador to Israel. In May 2018, Friedman caused controversy by standing in front of a poster showing the Temple Mount with Al-Aqsa eliminated and the third temple in its place. So we're back to that again. And if that wasn't enough, this weekend was marked by unexpected visits to Israel from leading GOP seditionists, including Ted Cruz and Lindsey Graham. Cruz, who flew off to Cancun during one of the worst weather disasters in Texas history, flew off to Israel on Memorial Day weekend to proclaim his fealty to the Israeli government and military and to spread propaganda about the recent violence, framing it as instigated by Hamas and ignoring Palestinian deaths. As for Graham, he posed for a picture with Netanyahu while holding up a sign that said, "More for Israel." This came after the Biden administration gave Israel a massive amount of aid following their slaughter of over 200 Palestinians. So why are GOP senators meeting with Netanyahu right before he may finally be removed from office? This is an important question to ask, since we have already seen the desperate moves Netanyahu has made to remain prime minister. We're reminding you that Netanyahu has been indicted multiple times and has escaped prosecution by abusing his position to claim immunity from arrest. And, this may sound familiar, may remind you of somebody. There have long been rumors that he may instigate a violent conflict with Iran to maintain power, and these rumors were heightened when Netanyahu said on Monday, and I quote, "An Iranian nuclear bomb is a threat for the continuation of the Zionist project, and we must fight it relentlessly. If we have to choose between friction with our great friend, the US, and the elimination of this existential threat, the elimination of the threat will come first." There's also been, in Israel, great worry about the safety of Bennett and other members of the Israeli parliament, and that Israel may be headed for its own January 6th style event. And so I'm going to read a couple of tweets from Israeli journalist and researcher Myra Zonstein summarizing these concerns. She says, "One of the scariest parts of this moment in Israeli politics is that if Netanyahu is finally out, there may very well be violent right-wingers attacking Knesset members and citizens. They are already inciting against them. The fact that Bennett and Shaked are being incited against from the right and require high-level security is evidence that Israeli society's most salient political ideology is hatred." And so this is a fast-moving, dangerous situation on multiple fronts with ramifications for the US and for the world. Andrea, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's clear that the assassin of Yitzhak Rabin has been normalized, that level of political violence, of intimidation and terrorism. And it's a dangerous time, obviously, as you pointed out. But I want to make a global point, and then we'll go back to the local discussion of what's going on in Israel. The global point is this. We're up against far-right Animal Farm, wherever it is, whether it's the Catholic Evangelical Coalition of the Republican Party uniting with Israel against all Muslims and brown and black people everywhere. That far-right Animal Farm is global, it's everywhere. It's in Canada, it's in Great Britain, it's across the EU, it's in New Zealand, it's in Australia. And as the climate crisis gets worse, the far-right Animal Farm is going to push their far-right free market ideology, whatever their religious ideology may be, evangelical, Catholic, this extreme Judaism that we're seeing, the very staunch Orthodox. Not all Christians are bad, not all evangelicals are bad, not all Catholics are bad, so forth. I understand across the spectrum there's people working for real human rights and social justice issues and environmental welfare. But what we're talking about is the gaslighting, where religions are going to an extreme level to justify horrific abuses of power and corruption to stay in power. And as the climate crisis gets worse and destabilizing the entire planet and creating an unimaginable displacement of human beings everywhere around the planet, you're going to see mass movements and people living in poverty, largely people of color, displaced, and refugee camps springing up in very rich nations, including very rich nations. So over the coming years, the far-right Animal Farm, if it's not checked and contained through simple law and order, through creating transparency, for creating reforms, from rolling back the violence and the destabilization and the rampant inequality caused by deregulation and so forth, if you don't put the far-right free market ideology in a box and contain it, we're in for a Mad Max future here. And that's not hysteria. That's not hyperbole. These forces, they know the planet's fucked, or they want it to be fucked because of some religious far out there belief, right? A lot of these guys, especially in the American Republican side, like Pompeo, believe in an apocalyptic doomsday death cult. And so I just want to point that out, that it's a time of ideology again, and that it's a free market ideology in Mnuchin's case, and it's an apocalyptic religious ideology in Pompeo's case. It's a white patriarchy at all costs in the staunch Catholics case, and also in the Orthodox Jewish case and so forth. So we're up against these very dangerous forces, all of us. So I'm just pointing that out as a global reminder that the far-right Animal Farm virus, nobody is immune to it, no nation. So please be vigilant of all these issues, even though we're right now currently focused on Israel. We're holding Israel up as an example because we had Netanyahu there, entrenched in power, exercising these dark arts, closely allied with Putin, putting up posters of himself with Putin, shaking hands in his campaigns, chipping away at democracy in Israel, creating, normalizing state terror, normalizing intimidation of opponents, normalizing corruption. And now his time is up. And what Israeli analysts keep reminding us of is that never, ever, ever count Netanyahu out. He is the most dangerous when he's cornered, and currently he is cornered. And the coalition to replace him, if it does go through, is a fragile one. It's like you basically have to be extremely hated to bring such a diverse group together. So Lindsey Graham going over there and spending Memorial Day weekend, which is a cherished American holiday. This is equivalent to all those Republicans that spent 4th of July in Russia, right? Like Lindsey Graham
and 9/11.
And 9/11. Lindsey Graham going over to Israel for Memorial Day weekend to prop up his buddy Netanyahu when his premiership is on death's door is a clear show of support and strength, and trying to do whatever the Republican Party can to keep their friend, the mass murdering aspiring autocrat, indicted on corruption charges and facing prison, in power. Because what we're up against is a globally united far-right Animal Farm. The coalition to remove Netanyahu will not be successful until the new prime minister is sworn in. Until then, we're all holding our breath, because no one trusts Netanyahu. He's dangerous, and anything can happen as he desperately clings to power at all costs. The opposition has until this Wednesday to form the new government, so watch the news out of Israel on Wednesday. And if they're successful, the new government will be sworn in as early as June 8th. But what's extremely troubling and concerning about this is the new coalition is a deal with the devil. As Sarah already pointed out, Bennett is far right. He looks like Stephen Miller's older brother, and he carries Stephen Miller's genocidal leanings, as has been widely documented. Netanyahu was his mentor. These morally corrupt ideologues have no problem eating their own. So the question is, will Bennett cling to power like his mentor Netanyahu is currently doing? When it's time for Bennett to hold up his end of the bargain and let his more tolerant political opponent Lapid take over as prime minister, will he do so? Will Bennett step down? The coalition depends on power sharing, and the hardliner Bennett gets to hold power first. That's the risk the coalition is taking. And it's a suspenseful one, as we've seen with the Netanyahu's own track record.
This episode of Gaslit Nation is sponsored by Best Fiends, a puzzle game you can play on your phone. Best Fiends has something new every day. There are always new levels, events, and challenges to keep you entertained. With Best Fiends, you can collect cute characters, solve puzzles, and play alongside your friends and family. There are literally thousands of levels to play and tons of characters to collect. My family members love it, and they've already passed level 400. Best Fiends is made for adults, but it's bright, colorful, fun, and approachable for everyone. Engage your brain with fun puzzles and collect tons of cute characters. Trust me, with over 100 million downloads, this 5-star rated mobile puzzle game is a must-play. Download Best Fiends free on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R. Best Fiends. Last year was rough on everyone. From politics to the pandemic, the entire world was affected in some way or another. That's why it's time for everyone to turn a corner, to move forward from the things holding us back, and to take the lessons we learned in 2020 and apply them to our lives from now on. Turn a corner with therapy. The sooner you start, the further you'll go. Talkspace lets you send and receive unlimited messages with your dedicated therapist in the Talkspace platform 24/7. With Talkspace, you set goals with your therapist and they hold you accountable and make sure you're really progressing. Therapy can help shift your perspective, find tools to cope in difficult times, and be a guiding light. Talkspace is a fraction of the cost of in-person therapy. Instead of waiting for an appointment, you can send unlimited messages to your therapist 24/7, and they'll engage with you daily, 5 days a week. As a listener of this podcast, you'll get $100 off of your first month with Talkspace. To match with a licensed therapist today, go to Talkspace.com. Make sure to use the code GASLIT to get $100 off of your first month and show your support for the show. That's Gaslit and Talkspace.com. Yeah, exactly. And, Netanyahu is somebody who has been a seminal political figure in Israel for, my entire lifetime. He's somebody whose links into American politics go very deep. I mean, this is where he grew up in part and studied. He was the ambassador to the United Nations. He spent quite a lot of time in New York getting to know Fred Trump, among others, Donald Trump, very close with the Kushner family. As we've mentioned before, he would stay at the Kushner's house. He was able to do things that leaders of other countries just simply couldn't do, like in 2015 when he addressed only the GOP in Congress. Netanyahu, of course, he hated Obama. He hates the Democrats. He's very blunt about this. He's very kind of Trumpian in the way that he can make these incredible denouncements, these incredibly hateful comments about people. And he is still treated with deference by the people that he insults. Like the relationship that Netanyahu has to politicians in the United States reminds me a lot of the relationship that Trump has had to members of the Republican Party, where he belittles them, he degrades them, he insults them, and they just give and give and give and give more. And that's the kind of relationship you have if you are working with organized crime, if you're working with somebody who has the power to truly hurt you, if you're working with somebody who can blackmail you, threaten you. They just keep giving and giving. And so this whole situation, I mean, it also kind of brings to mind during the times when folks thought Trump might actually be removed from office, and they were like, okay, well, then what does it mean if we have Mike Pence? Is that really any better? Because Mike Pence is a far-right, ultra-religious ideologue who has all of these hateful positions. And I kind of see this as analogous. Like, I think with Bennett, you don't have the same kleptocratic node that you have with Netanyahu. Even though Bennett is also from the United States originally, like he's not as immersed in the world of US politics as Netanyahu was. And so there's just a little bit of breathing room there. But the implications for the region, the implications for the world are so dire. And I'm curious to see what the Republicans will do if Netanyahu actually does leave, whether their fealty will remain with him over Bennett, or whether it really is, as they claim, a special relationship with Israel, a loyalty to Israel. Again, I think when you're looking at these evangelicals in particular, this is not some sort of nice, noble, let's be friends with democracies. I mean, first of all, Israel under Netanyahu became a far-right state. Its democratic institutions have eroded, similarly to the United States, the UK, Hungary, Poland. It's part of this broader global movement that Andrea was just outlining of repression worldwide, especially in places where there used to be, more freedom, or at least more kind of respect of protocols and norms. That's out the window. And so I am curious, what they will do. But a lot of people have very apocalyptic ambitions here. I think Pompeo is really the most dangerous one because, he has said himself that he believes the rapture is coming. He believes the end times are near. And so when you look at things that are existential threats like climate change, like nuclear war, like COVID-19, none of these people see mass death as a problem. None of them see the end of the world really as a problem, as long as they personally are insulated from it. And I think there are plenty of manipulative actors who actually don't believe in any of this shit. They're just along for the ride. They're just enjoying the idea of, basically ruling over the ashes, accumulating as much wealth and power as possible, and then hiding it behind a religious pretext that allows them to market it to the masses so that, people don't stop them from achieving these goals. I mean, it's very frightening. And again, I want to reiterate Andrea's point that this is not specific to any kind of religion. It's not specific to any country. And in that sense, it's not inevitable. People can make choices. They can try to stop this. They can try to hold bad actors accountable. And I hope that in Israel, since Netanyahu has been indicted for corruption so many times, I hope he is finally held accountable. Because we certainly haven't fulfilled our end of the bargain in the United States by holding Trump and his administration accountable. Instead, we have utter lawlessness and, threats of new coups like Michael Flynn made over the weekend, and he's only able to do that, of course, because he was never punished or held accountable in the first place. He was pardoned by Trump. Israel is in danger, the United States is in danger, and the people who are most vulnerable within those countries or with any kind of big, powerful country, in this case, the Palestinians in Israel and in the United States, basically anybody who is not white, they are in the most danger because that's the kind of power structure that we are unfortunately dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Which brings us to the GOP in Texas.
Yes. So, we spent all of last week's episode just laying out the fact that the Biden administration is doing very little, and the Democratic leaders anyway, are doing very little to protect our country from the GOP onslaught, in particular, the ongoing onslaught against voting rights
to be clear, the Democratic leaders that want something to be done are apparently outnumbered or being held back by Democratic leadership.
Yeah, everyone, they're always like, who do you mean? So I'm just going to say who I mean. I mean Pelosi and Schumer, and of course, Manchin and Sinema, who we all know are obstructionists, and we've talked about that many times. But there is very little pressure on Manchin or Sinema to change their ways. There is very little public pressure, at the least, being applied by Joe Biden or by other members of the Biden administration. And we have warned you many times that when people look like they're not doing anything, they're probably not doing anything. Like there's all this rhetoric like, ooh, there's a secret plan, there's 3D chess. That is not even almost, that is never the case. We warned you about this with Mueller. We warned you.
Wait, 3D chess is a coping mechanism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. 3D chess is what people say when they don't understand what's going on. The situation is terrifying. They don't want to confront that terror. So they play little mind games to make themselves feel better, which I'm sorry, we do not have time for that anymore. Like my patience has run out. I kind of understood why people were doing this with the Mueller probe, because the situation was new. Most Americans weren't used to thinking about autocracy, about the mechanisms of organized crime, about the total, demolition of norms and protocols. They weren't thinking about what's possible. We are out of the realm of hypotheticals. And what you see before your eyes is what's actually happening. And what's actually happening is basically nothing. We are running out of time. We had Adam Gentleson on the show in February. He is an expert on the filibuster. He wrote a book about it. He was explaining the urgency of this moment, that they need to get rid of the filibuster and they need to pass voting rights acts in order to make it possible for our democracy to continue. We do not have 4 years. We have at best until 2022. And I'm just going to say briefly, and then I think Andrea is going to explain to you more about different voting rights bills that need to be enacted. But, when we brought up the Texas House Democrats, these are among the very few people I've seen really doing something, putting it out there, standing up to power, standing up to the American people. So we salute you, Texas House Democrats, and everybody who's been saying, like, fuck Texas or let them secede, like, fuck you, honestly. So anyway, this is what Texas House Democrats bravely did over the weekend. They killed SB 7, which was the most suppressive voter disenfranchisement bill in the United States, a bill that made it much harder to vote, purposely targeted racial minorities, and made it much easier for the state legislature to simply overturn the elections. How did they do this? The Texas House Democrats defeated this bill, and I have to emphasize this is temporary. This is going to come back, but they at least staved it off for now by walking out in unison and making the vote impossible. They did this to protect Texas, but also to send a message to the Biden administration, which has been refusing to help them protect their voting rights. One Texas official, Representative Trey Martinez Fisher, said, and I quote, "Breaking quorum is about the equivalent of crawling on our knees, begging the president in the United States Congress to give us the For the People Act and give us the John Lewis Voting Rights Act." Another Texas official, Representative Aaron Zoiner, said, "We did our part to stop SB 7. Now we need Congress to do their part." So do you want to explain what these different bills are?
Well, I want to go into a larger warning about what we're up against so people understand the enemy's justification. Because, for instance, in screenwriting 101, you always have to have your villain justify in their minds why they do what they do. And I wanted to enter together, because that's safer together, the minds of the autocrats that we're up against, because they are extraordinarily skilled and very well organized. And they organize through religion. They organize through Catholicism, a form of Catholicism. Again, I have friends who are Catholic, who are progressive. So I don't want to put, when we mention religion in the context of Republicans, we're talking about a hardline far right. So I'm going to just go down what we're up against in terms of the main arena, which is voting rights, which is if we lose our voting rights, if Biden and Democratic leadership allow us to become a voter-suppressed country, it's game over. So now to enter the minds of what we're up against and what needs to be done about all this. So one thing to note is that in October 2020, when we're all busy trying to defeat an aspiring autocrat carrying out a coup, Senator Mike Lee of Utah wrote an op-ed, and that op-ed, which we'll link to in the show notes, available as always on our Patreon page for this week's episode, that op-ed is called, "Of Course We're Not a Democracy." He published this in firstthings.com, which is a Catholic site founded by a Roman Catholic priest who was a close advisor to George W. Bush. It's a hugely influential site among Republicans, among conservatives, and shows how the Republican Party of William F. Buckley, a staunch Catholic and the founder of the National Review, lives on. Mike Lee's essay is a modern-day version of William F. Buckley's 1957 essay, "Why the South Must Prevail," where Buckley argued that the white race is the superior race and therefore must do whatever it takes to rule over Black people. Now, Buckley went on to become horrified by the extent to which his ideas were carried out in practice, including being critical of the 1963 Birmingham church bombing by a white supremacist that killed 4 girls, ages 11 and 14. Buckley was reportedly horrified by that terrorist attack and blamed Alabama's Trumpian governor, George Wallace. But who did Buckley think he was inspiring when he wrote "Why the South Must Prevail"? Buckley's long career set off the bomb in Birmingham just as much as the Klan did. which brings us back to the new version of why the South must prevail, provided by Senator Mike Lee, who's the closest the Republican Party has today to an intellectual. In October 2020, Mike Lee wrote in his essay, again for a hugely influential conservative Catholic site, he wrote, "Our system of government is best described as a constitutional republic. Power is not found in mere majorities, but in carefully balanced power. Under our Constitution, passing a bill in the House of Representatives, the body most reflective of current majority views, isn't enough for it to become law. Legislation must also be passed by the Senate, where each state is represented equally, regardless of population, where members have longer terms, and where, under current rules, a supermajority vote is typically required to bring debate to a close." Thomas Jefferson described the Senate as, quote, "the saucer that cools hot passions more prevalent in the House. It's where consensus is forged as senators reach compromise across regional, cultural, and partisan lines." Now, I'm going to go back to the comment, because this is me talking. Mike Lee's little piece is excerpts over now. This is extraordinary writing. It's gaslighting. Instead of doing what Buckley did in 1957 and argue plainly for white supremacy and voter suppression, Mike Lee in 2020 is leaving out the fact that several districts that decide who goes to the House of Representatives and Congress have been severely gerrymandered by Republicans, which gives rise to far-right extremism in Congress. In the gerrymandered districts, Republicans don't need to worry about a fair contest in the general election. They just need to worry about winning the primary and pandering to the Republican base. Republican gerrymandering is chipping away at the checks and balances in the House of Representatives. Mike Lee also conveniently leaves out that the Senate was a controversial body for the Founding Fathers, because how fair was it at the time to give smaller states the same amount of representation as more populous states? But it got pushed through to the benefit of largely rural, agrarian, slave-owning states. And that imbalance of power led to more imbalance of power as the slave-owning states of the South, like South Carolina, normalized the abuse of the filibuster to impede progress for Black people in America. And the filibuster gets used to the same effect and for the same reasons today. The filibuster is a weapon of white supremacy invented by a controversial body, all right? And again, the Senate, as Adam Gentleson explained to us on the show, was modeled on the House of Lords in the United Kingdom. If you follow Gaslit Nation, we've explained how Great Britain is awash right now with the Russian oligarch blood money. You had a lordship in the House of Lords, essentially purchased by a Russian oligarch. And all of that, in turn, all of that Russian blood money, including buying political power in the House of Lords, that chips away at a nation's sovereignty. And that's what the UK is facing. You had Kremlin influence tipping the Brexit vote. You have the UK failing to hold Putin's mass murdering regime accountable, even though it's murdering people on British soil. So again, the House of Lords is controversial today in the UK in terms of the sovereignty vulnerabilities that it's creating for that country. And this is what our own Senate was modeled on. It's a power of the elites. And the elites, wanting to stay elites, can easily purchase that power, can easily sell that power. And what you have is a growing imbalance of power. So Mike Lee conveniently leaves all of that out in this neat little essay. What this shows more than anything is that the Republicans are getting better at gaslighting. And in their minds, they fear what they see as mob rule. So they equate majority rule as mob rule. And increasingly, what they see as a mob rule in the US is this Marxist takeover. I've been going down the rabbit hole on a lot of these blogs by these far-right influential thinkers. And again, I keep getting brought back to Catholic websites, Catholic thinkers, white men. And they really believe that the white men really believe in America on the Republican side that they are protecting humanity from Black, brown, Marxist, violent mobs that are going to bring Soviet breadlines and Soviet mass death and Soviet gulags to America. In their minds, they were completely justified in what they're doing. And of course, by suppressing the vote, they enrich themselves and stay in power, and the whole cycle perpetuates. So what to do about it now? So today, Greg Sargent shares a letter signed by 100 scholars where they make a plea to Democratic leadership saying, you better get serious about voting rights, or else we're going to lose our democracy. And one point that these scholars make, and we'll link to their statement in the show notes, one point they make is that it's not enough to have the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. You also have to have the For the People Act. You need both. So understand, we are fighting not just for one bill, but for two bills, because our democracy is so imperiled and the effort to suppress the vote is so well organized. I mean, remember, this is a Koch-funded effort to suppress the vote. Mitch McConnell's on board. The Republicans are carrying this out on the all-important state level. And so in order to have a fighting chance, we need not one, but two bills. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which is going to restore a lot of the protections that were gutted by John Roberts' Supreme Court in the Voting Rights Act when they gutted that act, which led to the closure of well over 1,000 polling places across the country and counting. So we need the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and in addition, the For the People Act. Two damn bills we need to pass in Congress. How are we going to get that passed if Manchin and Sinema refuse filibuster reform? How are we going to get those two important bills passed in law if Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, and Chuck Schumer refuse to go public in making appeals and pressure on Manchin and Sinema? And if anybody is thinking to themselves, oh, but you're going to drive Manchin and Sinema into the Republican Party, they're already behaving like Koch-funded Republicans by obstructing this. So at least we'll have that confirmation. If they want to go to the Republican Party officially, let them go. Let them put that on the historical record. That is on them. But what we need right now is a well thought out public display of leadership, letting the American people know and going on an education tour if need be, Joe Biden at the helm of it, saying, pass these two bills, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the For the People Act, two, not one, two, to ensure our democracy has a fighting chance. Anything less than that drives us further down the road of Republican authoritarianism.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, Sinema, of course, did not bother to show up for the vote to have a bipartisan commission to investigate the January 6th attacks. She's been flagrantly going against the will and the platform of the Democratic Party. So yes, all this timidity surrounding them, like, oh dear, we must not upset them, or they might do things that are really reprehensible and actually fatal to our democracy. It's like, yeah, they're already doing that, and it might as well just have it all out on the table. Like, you cannot defeat an enemy or a potential enemy if you don't understand it, if you don't understand why they're doing the things they're doing. And we did a whole episode about Joe Manchin, about a lot of really troubling things he's done in his past, troubling positions. You can go look at that in our archives. We have not as much on Sinema, and I've seen, very little investigatory journalism aimed her way. My advice would definitely be to follow the money, because the thing is, if the Republicans do take over, if this iteration of the Republican Party, an openly apocalyptic cult, an anti-democracy Republican Party that is just very overt in that aim, if they take over, that's it. It's tyranny of the minority. It's authoritarian rule. And we've seen this happen in other countries around the world. This is what, I think Hungary is probably one of the best examples. It can happen here. It can happen anywhere. It's very hard to get rid of. This is what we have been telling you over and over and over again for 6 years, the two of us together. And I don't know, folks don't seem to grasp it. Or actually, I think the American people do. Our officials, particularly the most powerful, people like Schumer and Pelosi and Biden, act as if they don't care. I mean, if I was in that position, I would be doing absolutely everything possible to ensure that our country retains its sovereignty, to ensure that people retain their rights, to ensure, of course, that people retain their voting rights, both so that the Democratic Party, for which, they serve and have represented for so long, that it survives. But I mean, just think about what the American people did in November. We were nearing the height of a pandemic. We were dealing with voter suppression that we had never seen. Things like the dismantling of the postal service so that, people couldn't vote by mail. And this, of course, was done by Louis DeJoy, who still has not been removed from his position, but that's another story. People went up against incredible odds, against a sociopathic, aspiring autocrat, a career criminal surrounded by mafia operatives, violent white supremacists, all this stuff. It went, and they voted anyway. And they voted in Joe Biden. And then they did it again with Georgia. And they got 2 Democratic senators for Georgia. They changed ostensibly the balance of power in the Senate. I mean, those are amazing achievements for American people. And American people should feel very proud of what they did. And they should feel very betrayed by what is going on now and by how the Biden administration is behaving and by how the leadership of the House and the Senate are behaving. And, the Democrats are not a monolith. We've seen a lot of people speaking out, a lot of representatives and senators speaking out and expressing their alarm about this situation. My message for them is you need to unite with each other. Those Democratic representatives who actually care about saving this country, about having free and fair elections, about having the American experiment not come to an end, you need to unite and you need to oust bad leadership or at least work around bad leadership. I really don't care how you get it done, but you owe people that. You owe everybody that. You owe your country that. And if they don't understand that, then I don't know what comes next, but it's not going to be good. And so on that note, as another example of Biden administration failure to hold criminal actors accountable and to preserve our democracy, we'll very briefly go into what Merrick Garland has been doing. We tried to warn you about Merrick Garland, that this was not a person who should be the attorney general. He's very quickly proving that. His first action, which protected, Trump, Barr, Mueller, and the very corrupt institution of the DOJ, was when he would not release the full 2019 OLC memo describing Trump as immune to prosecution by the Mueller probe. He wouldn't investigate how Barr obstructed the Mueller investigation. This is despite the pleas of Judge Amy Berman Jackson, who was the judge in the Roger Stone trial. She basically implored him to do this. And Garland has sought to, you could say he's protecting the DOJ, but what does that mean? It means you're protecting elite criminal impunity. You're protecting a broken organization that for decades has been guarding these criminals. If you protect the latest version of Bill Barr being the attorney general, that opens a can of worms. That means you're going to be looking at things that Bill Barr did in, the quote, good old days that people like to refer to about the Republican Party that were really not that good. Because what Bill Barr was doing under George H.W. Bush, for example, was letting all the Iran-Contra guys off the hook. That opens up Iran-Contra and so on. This is what I think is going on with Merrick Garland and the DOJ. I tend to think it's less of a personal matter for him, but I definitely don't think he has the guts to actually stand up to powerful criminal actors. I don't think he has the guts to examine the flaws within the system. And I think the worst example of this is that this week, he asked judges to dismiss lawsuits against both Bill Barr and Trump for gassing and beating Black rights protesters who had assembled in Lafayette Square 1 year ago to protest the murder of George Floyd. And Trump, of course, enlisted military officials to help them. Garland, through this action, is legitimating the Trump administration's brutal impunity. He is helping them cover up their crimes. The decision creates a terrifying precedent for future executive acts of brutality against protesters. One of the directors of the ACLU noted that under Garland's argument, and I'm going to quote him here, the U.S. could have used live ammunition to clear the park, and nobody would have a claim against that as an assault on their constitutional rights. And just a little refresher of what happened that day, I'm going to read very briefly from the Washington Post. I know a lot of folks like to block out things that happened during the Trump administration, and that's understandable. But to kind of take you back in time, this is what was happening 1 year ago. Trump called on governors to, quote, dominate your city and your state in the hours before the crackdown, adding, quote, in Washington, we're going to do something people haven't seen before. Earlier, Trump tweeted, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, as protests raged in Minneapolis. Trump also threatened that if demonstrators outside the White House breached its gates, they, quote, would have been greeted with the most vicious dogs and the most ominous weapons I have ever seen, which is, of course, very ironic because then Trump encouraged violent insurrectionists to storm the Capitol, and that's obviously fine. They're doing it on his behalf. But anyway, that should make clear to you how dangerous this decision by Merrick Garland's DOJ is. And it's going hand in hand with other decisions the Biden administration is making that are wrong and dangerous, like refusing to release Trump's taxes to Congress, to the House Democrats. I believe Cruz, the ethics organization, is suing Janet Yellen over this because the House has been demanding this since 2019. And originally people thought, well, of course, the Trump administration is not going to release it. It's his taxes. There's all sorts of damning information there. So why is the Biden administration covering this up as well? I have some theories. They're in my book, Hiding in Plain Sight. You can go get that. But since we're running out of time, Andrea, do you have thoughts on Merrick Garland?
Well, if Merrick Garland and the Biden White House continues down that path, it's going to be part of the pattern of what Obama did by letting the same people that created the global financial crash in 2008 in the United States be in charge of building Wall Street back up and paying themselves lavish bonuses with U.S. taxpayer dollars. And then what happens? There's no accountability. Nobody goes to prison except for one random guy. The banks all get bailed out, and Wall Street again is a gambling den. And income inequality is reaching historic levels. So this is going to be Biden's version of that. If Merrick Garland and Biden decide to protect the executive branch, to me, it's just, they cannot do that. They simply cannot do that. We cannot afford for them to do that. It is so deeply dangerous. Whatever justification they might have in their minds, whether they're bought off, whether they're controlled opposition, whether they're all making money from the same trough of corporate donors, a combination of that, whether they think that in addition to all those things, that if they protect the executive branch, then they're protecting Biden from the Benghazi witch hunts of the Republican far right. What matters now is not to give away your power. It's scary using your power. It's scary sticking your neck out and demanding accountability and standing up to people. It's not ever comfortable. But look at the people who are putting their lives on the line. Look at an activist in Belarus who just slit his own throat in a court to protest Putin's little lackey, Lukashenko, the dictator of Belarus, and all the human rights abuses he's carrying out there. If Biden and Merrick Garland and the rest of that White House do not stick their necks out now, they are sentencing future children on American soil of having to put their lives literally on the line to reclaim our democracy. Our discussion continues, and you can get access to that by signing up on our Patreon at the Truth Teller level or higher.
We want to encourage you to donate to your local food bank, which is experiencing a spike in demand. We also encourage you to donate to GLAAD, an organization on the front lines of fighting for the rights of LGBTQ people at a time when they, especially trans people, are under attack by repressive and harmful Republican legal warfare. Support their critical work at GLAAD, GLAAD.org.
We also encourage you to donate to the International Rescue Committee, a humanitarian relief organization helping refugees from Syria. Donate at rescue.org. And if you want to help critically endangered orangutans already under pressure from the palm oil industry, donate to the Orangutan Project at theorangutanproject.org. Gaslit Nation is produced by Sarah Kenzier and Andrea Chalupa. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us reach more listeners. And check out our Patreon, it keeps us going. And you can also subscribe to us on YouTube.
Our production managers are Nicholas Torres and Carlin Daigle. Our episodes are edited by Nicholas Torres, and our Patreon-exclusive content is edited by Carlin Daigle.
Original music in Gaslit Nation is produced by David Whitehead, Martin Vissenberg, Nick Farr, Damian Arriaga, and Carlin Daigle.
Our logo design was donated to us by Hamish Smith of the New York-based firm Porter. Thank you so much, Hamish.
Gaslit Nation would like to thank our supporters at the producer level on Patreon and higher: Sean Rubin,
Todd S. Perlstein,
Pat,
Kenny Main,
John Schoenthaler,
Frank Jacquette,
Ellen McGirt,
Joel Farron,
Larry Gasson,
Erica Moore,
Karen A. Deal,
Nico Phillips,
Brian E. Castor,
Lex Reed,
Andrea Scalzo,
Malicia Howland,
Karen Heisler,
Jordan Sanders,
Ann Bertino,
Rachel Winder,
T.R. Dunstan,
Kim,
John Millett,
David East,
Shannon Nacy,
Ida,
Chris Fellow,
Jody Pop,
Kristen Bredimus,
Ben Wheaton,
Joseph Mara Jr.,
Rich Holcomb,
Thomas Scheibe,
Kelsey Malsom,
Julie Matthews,
Meganopolis,
Mark,
Matthew Womack,
Sean Berg,
Kristen Custer,
Tracy Ash,
Benjamin Galuza,
Kai Gillis,
Sharon Hattrick,
Irv Robinson,
Keith Goldschach,
William Barry Reeves,
John Atris,
Richard Smith,
Emmy,
Kevin Gannon,
Sandra Collins,
Katie Masuris,
John Laughlin,
Jeff Thompson,
James D. Leonard,
Evan Rosemore,
Leo Chalupa,
Carol Golstad,
Michael Wooldridge,
Crimer No Criming,
Jason Benke,
Joe Darcy,
Ann Marshall,
Jeremy Lewis,
Shriegvik,
Christine M.,
D.L. Singfield,
Matt Perez,
Nicole Spear,
Kelly Ranson,
Brian Tajudin,
Christy Vitale,
Maureen Murphy,
Michelle Dash,
Jens Eilstrup Rasmussen,
Dorothy Kamerick,
Victoria Olson,
Alabama,
ZW,
Lisa LaFlame,
Jason Bainbridge,
Catherine Anderson Karina,
Sarah Gray,
Mike Tripico,
Diana Gallagher,
John Ripley,
Ethan Mann,
Jennifer Slavic,
Yay Itzma,
David Porter,
Kate Cotton,
Kim Mellon,
Leah Campbell,
Lynn Schneider,
Jared Lombardo,
Karen Humphreys,
Giles Boquet,
Ann Marshall,
Irina Guardia,
Eric Kaplan,
Sonia Bogdanovich,
and Tanya Chalupa. Thank you all for your support of the show. We could not make Gaslit Nation without you.